Hello, everyone. Welcome to Perspectives in Professional Psychology. I'm Dr. Lance Garrison, Dean for the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School, and we are joined today by Dr. Brenda Huber, Department Chair for our School Psychology programs in Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Huber.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Garrison.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit today, maybe a lot actually, about school safety, gun violence, and some of the kind of the mental health underpinnings associated with many of the tragedies that we've seen across the country over the last several years. And, as I was thinking about our talk today, Dr. Huber, I couldn't help but go back in my history. It's been a while since I've been in school, but I grew up in a kind of very small, rural West Texas town. And a lot has changed since then, because I know when I was in school, it's a big hunting culture in West Texas. And at the time, when I was at high school, it was not uncommon for kids to drive their truck or their car to school and have a rifle mounted in the back window of the truck. And, it was just never, I never experienced a school shooting, and it just was not ever a topic of conversation. No one felt at risk by that. But there's no way, obviously, that kind of access to guns in proximity to a school is not allowed today. But back then, school shootings were unheard of, and kids were bringing guns to school, at least in my small town. And now, we have all of these prohibitions about firearms and weapons in school, but school shootings feel like they're more common than they have ever been. What do you think has changed over that time?
Yeah, it's a complex interplay of a lot of different factors. I grew up in rural Indiana, and the same
Yeah,
was true for me. And I think there's two major factors. One is our relationship with media.
sure.
So it's completely different from when I was growing up, and also our relationship with guns. If you
Yeah,
think about it, like when I was a child, I had a BB gun. People
yeah,
around me had guns, and we were told all the time, "Don't point it at a person.
yeah,
Don't point it at a person." And it was understood that guns were for hunting or for sport.
yeah,
So we would line up cans and shoot cans and things like that. It was very common hobby. And over time, we, as do young people now, we see guns in television and movies being used completely differently, right? In fact,
right.
most of the time when you see a gun in a movie or a television, it's pointed at a person. And
Yeah,
so to some degree, we've gotten desensitized, in our view of what guns are for has been shaped by media. And then when you add in the advancements in video games. When I was a kid, video games were Pac-Man and
right.
Atari and stuff like that. I'm really dating myself now. But when you see, I mean, that video games, from the first person shooter view,
Yeah,
were developed to desensitize and train the armed forces to
yeah,
use weapons to harm other people. And so they were to practice and desensitize to exactly what we were really taught: don't ever point a gun at a person. And then in addition to that, within the video games that are just played for hours and hours and hours by young people now, often violence and aggression is the strategy to solve problems. And
right.
so there's a lot of practice of using violence or aggression to achieve one's goals, etc., to remove barriers to one's
Yeah,
goals through video games.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a really interesting point, because I think back, I played the Atari games as well, and the only shooting game I can remember was Duck Hunt. So it was
Yeah.
related to hunting, kind of. and just the lack of realism for video games back then, I think, was obviously quite different. It's so the first person shooter, the kind of the level of graphic violence in video games today has increased substantially. The realism, the availability, the amount of time that kids spend playing games like that, I think certainly has to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, it's like playing those video games is obviously not going to make somebody be a school shooter.
Right.
It's just that for kids who are at risk of being violent or aggressive, those games can really exacerbate that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point as well. I don't know that there's evidence that video games makes kids want to go shoot up a school or engages them to do that. But there's this intersection of
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability and risk and exposure to media, to video games and things like that that can certainly serve as an exacerbating factor, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So as we think about school shootings, what are some of the most common misperceptions or misconceptions about school shootings and school safety?
I would say that that prevention starts with hardening of a school. I
Okay.
think everybody wants to prevent the next school shooting. I mean, everybody that is like top of mind. Of course, everybody wants to prevent something from happening, and this idea that by hardening schools, such as putting in police officers or having
Sure.
educators have guns or have even metal detectors and things like that. What the research is showing is that that focus on the hardening actually makes students feel less safe,
Yeah.
and the school itself feel like a less safe environment, and they actually are. It's having a dampening effect on their achievement, on their actual educational attainment, which is exactly why they're going there.
Right.
The other thing I think when that people don't think about is that we can't use the same tactics to make a school safe that we would like use for a bank or some other kind of place where the sort of criminal's goal is to come in and take something from us and escape, right? Like
Sure.
breaking into our house or breaking into a bank, because the person's goal is to get the thing and then get out of there.
Right.
What we see in school shootings is it's much more like a terrorist attack, where the precious thing that we're protecting is actually the humans, the
Yeah.
predominantly women and children that are inside this school, and the intent of the person is to actually kill those people, right? And
Right.
so there's often no exit strategy. It's essentially a suicide mission, and it appears that the goal is to get in there and to harm as many people, make as big of a headline as possible. And the other thing that's really different about school shootings is that often it's an inside job. So about 75% of the time, a school shooter is either a student in that building or a former student.
Right.
So they know the inside of the school. They've often been trained along with their classmates on
Yeah.
what to do, and the expectations for, if somebody were to come to try to cause them harm. So it's
Yeah.
just a completely different animal. And so it's difficult. I mean, it's not like we have to start from scratch, but we can't just borrow things from other settings and apply them to schools, because really preparing and preventing school shootings is kind of unique to this particular sector.
Yeah, that it's interesting because to your point, the would-be school shooter, having very likely been a student there, would know the procedures
Yes.
for a school shooter. They know where people hide, where they're trying to secure themselves. So they're coming in with that intel, and it just makes it
Yeah.
much more challenging to defend against. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really unique situation.
Yeah. So when we think about the school shooter in particular, what are some of the risk factors for those individuals that are associated with that behavior of going in with the intent to do maximum damage? What do we see as risk factors for those folks?
Um, well, I want to start by just talking about sort of the culture or the climate of a school or a community where that sort of, I don't want to say breeds it, but like elevates the level of risk. It is a culture or climate that really doesn't teach kids social and emotional skills,
Mhm.
doesn't teach them how to experience their emotions, express their emotions, regulate their emotions, and to interact and be in community with other people. If you think about it, like all the students that are in our schools right now are digital natives. They have
Yeah.
grown up on tons of technology, and the social and emotional skills to interact and learn and be with others on technology is just different. And
Yeah.
so in schools, we're still bringing people together with the expectation that they know how to play together, they know how to relate, they know how to deal with their emotions in-person relationships.
Yeah.
And we just can't take that for granted. We need to explicitly teach it. And if we don't, we're actually elevating the level of risk. Specifically, the individuals that are great at risk to be a school shooter are individuals who are white and male. And that isn't because they're genetically, more predisposed to be a school shooter. Yet 62 to 87% of school shooters are white, and
Mhm.
96% of them are male. And so we have to think about like what it's like to be a boy and what it's like to be white in this kind of culture that I was just talking about.
Right.
So the socialization of boys, there's tons of research on it that if we socialize boys so they don't know how to experience their emotions, or if we give them the message that feeling emotions is weak or it's
Yeah.
shameful or it's feminine, we are really setting them up to have a lot of difficulty in their lives. And many of them grow up are engaging in comparison where they feel like their worth is tied to this masculinity and they're looking at where is the pecking order. So many times when somebody comes in and does a school shooting, it's really all about power and revenge. And it's like, I may die in this, but I'm going to show you that I'm not weak, right?
Yeah.
It is about establishing their strength and their power, and that's why it's like take out as many people as you can before you're uh, before you're stopped.
Right.
The other thing is about race. So over the last 40 years, like when we were young, like in 1980, 75% of students were white. Now 45% of students are white.
Mhm.
And this is a big change. It's happened over time, but we have, in this country, we definitely have a hierarchy where white demographic groups have fared best economically and in just about any other measure. And that continues to be true. And as we've, are counting, we do have some major problems in our country, like with the cost of housing relative to pay and things like that. But at the end of the day, white groups are still faring better than other demographic groups.
Mhm.
However, other racial groups are also faring better than they did in times past. And so there is a narrative that is communicated in the media that the American dream is slipping away from white folks. And
Interesting.
this is even true in terms of gender. So we see that the income and quality of life of college educated women is surpassing that
Yeah.
of non-college educated men. And
Yeah.
so there is definitely some progress in these other demographic groups, but the narrative is really that stoking the fears that white people are not going to be able to compete in some way,
Yeah.
right? And so when you couple that with this message of limited resources
Yeah.
and not equipping young people to manage their emotions and all of that. I mean, a big part of social emotional learning is setting goals, accomplishing your goals, having confidence and all those things. And so this narrative really puts white individuals, and particularly white boys, in a really scary situation where they have to assert their strength, their power, and fight for or defend what they may feel has been rightfully theirs, and it's slipping away.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's what I hear you saying is that there's, for a certain group, there's a risk of like extreme feelings of disenfranchisement,
Yes.
right? They're like, I'm losing something here. I don't know how to process that internally myself. I can't engage in the kind of internal dialogue, or I don't have the outlets to engage in the dialogue around that, or the skills. And so it leaves them in this, feeling backed into a corner, disenfranchised and desperate to kind of reassert a sense of control or dominance.
Absolutely. And, to have all that fear and literally not ever been taught skills, like what do I
Yeah.
even do with fear? It's not safe to experience fear, right? Because it
Yeah.
is literally proof that I am weak. And so
Yeah.
it's just really a setup. And once again, the very, very, very vast majority of white males are not going to resort to any aggression or any violence and all those kinds of things.
Right.
However, for the kids that we see coming and expressing, their emotions and in this fatal, lethal and fatal way, these are some of the factors that are impacting them. So in the schools, we do a lot of work. I'm a school psychologist by training, on working on building a positive school climate that is not only teaching those social emotional skills, but promoting the well-being and the sense of belonging of every student in that community, that they are all valued and needed, and there's a place for all of them, and they can all reach their aspirations.
You brought up something that I think a really important contextual factor that I hadn't considered, and it's that social emotional piece. And the first question I asked you was, hey, what's changed?
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago, this wasn't an issue. Now it's feels like
week.
a monthly issue, weekly issue. And I hadn't thought about how technology intersects with that. I know we touched on that, but the way that technology has impacted the social emotional, the interpersonal skills of kids these days. When I was in school, K through 12, we just worked that stuff out. We might get in fights on the playground. We would have arguments. We didn't have the technology escape valve to kind of hide ourselves from it, and to be online, to kind of lose yourself, or divert the stress of an interpersonal situation by going into social media or whatever it might be, playing a game. And so we had to develop those skills almost, right? We were in a context that required practicing those social emotional interpersonal skills on a day-to-day basis. Whereas kids today, post pandemic in particular, there's this immersion in technology and this escape valve that has, for a lot of kids, has become a maladaptive coping style for them, so they can avoid situations that might otherwise help them practice or develop those interpersonal, social, emotional skills by just kind of going into the phone or getting on their screen, whatever type of screen they have. So I think that's a really, really important point that you made. It has changed the dynamic incredibly, and filling that gap hasn't happened, right? And I think that's part of the school culture shift that you talked about that needs to happen.
Yeah, and really, talking to people.
Just talking to people.
Just talking to people that you're in relationship with, that care about you, when you're experiencing distress. It's just much more common. And the other thing, speaking about social media is so much of what's harmful within social media is social comparison.
Yes.
And it feeds what I was talking about earlier, where people are, they're determining how okay they are by looking at how okay they think other people are.
Yeah. Wildly unrealistic, unattainable perceptions in social media that just
Yeah.
fuel a sense of inadequacy and powerlessness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could touch on the role of mental health when it comes
Yeah.
to school violence. Obviously, we've talked about some of the cultural shifts over the years and um, technology's influence, social emotional learning. There's clearly a mental health component to these
Yeah.
school shootings. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't think there's like one particular mental health diagnosis that people would necessarily point to as being associated with a school shooting. I think there can be a lot of things, but I think some of the symptoms that we see are things like hopelessness,
Mhm.
feelings of helplessness, rage, just having poor problem-solving skills,
Yeah.
having a tendency towards aggression. I think probably the biggest common denominator is suicidality. A
Mm.
lot of times when we think about being suicidal, we think about somebody harming themselves, but often this is, basically somebody says, well, this is how I'm going to kill myself, right?
Yeah.
And it's these other factors that lead a suicidal person to choose to harm others, while a lot of people who kill themselves think it's because the world would be better off without them, right? They're not the person with suicidality who's going to do something like this, right?
Yeah.
um, so I think many schools have universal screening to try to identify kids who are having symptoms of depression and anxiety or suicidality, so that they can intervene early and support
Mhm.
those young people and let them know that there are resources, there is help, and they can um, they can move past this to a healthy life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? There's a sense of hopelessness that comes along with that disenfranchised feeling.
Yeah.
Um, but when you have that sense of hopelessness, which is associated with depression and suicidal ideation, and you lay on top of that the anger, the rage um, that can come along with being in a school setting where you don't have the skills to cope adequately, that makes a lot of sense. It's a terrible combination that I can see would
Yeah.
facilitate that kind of behavior. You touched on kind of some of the more ill-informed aspects of trying to lock down a school, right? To create
Hmm.
it's well intentioned, right? But some of the actions to make schools safe um, end up making the kids there feel less safe. Are there some
Hmm.
other ill-informed or ineffective responses to school safety that you've seen?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I have seen is the use of active shooter drills.
Mm,
um, in sort of a one size fits all kind of way,
yeah,
especially when they first were introduced and mandated here in Illinois. There was a real push to make them absolutely as realistic as possible, even making them be unannounced. It was required that law enforcement and students would be involved, and they traumatized a lot of people.
yeah,
And it was super dangerous to have these. Especially if they were unannounced, people didn't know if there was actually somebody
yeah,
in the building with a gun. And so when you think about it, just like if you're trying to, handle any other situation, like there's different things that law enforcement and administrators need to know and to practice than there is for teachers to be able to know and to practice, and for students to be able to
sure,
know and to practice, right? And so the idea that we have these dramatic, big active shooter drills that literally traumatize
yeah,
people. You think about in schools, we have kids with autism, we have kids with disabilities, we have, adults with their own trauma history. The way those active shooter drills have been done in a lot of places have been really damaging. I feel like things are getting better when it comes to that because emergency management folks have been partnering with mental health individuals. We have on like the Illinois Terrorism Task Force, there's social workers, there's psychologists that are informing those plans because they're hearkening back to what we were talking about earlier, that schools are different. Schools are different than, storming a bank or, a SWAT team storming a bank. The other thing I want to mention is that communities that rely on punishment paradigms are not that effective in reducing aggression, because essentially what you have is the adults saying, we have more power and we're going to bully you to do the things that we want you to do. And it's just kind of more of the same. And so communities that can get away from relying on punishment as their go-to and understand that these kids that are at risk and are hurting, right? And we need to figure out how to help them, and making them feel small, making them feel shame, making them feel more powerless is actually counterproductive.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. A couple years ago, my youngest son's school went into lockdown. It wasn't a drill. There was a real situation in a surrounding neighborhood. And I happened to be there as the school let out after that situation. And the kids were terrified. Yeah, I think my son was in third grade at the time. And, I no social emotional trauma history, but even with him, we spent several days kind of talking about that. And yes, you're safe. This is an okay place to be. So I can see where, just your regular run-of-the-mill everyday kid without any kind of significant mental health challenges would be traumatized by that. But there are a lot of kids out there with histories of trauma, with developmental disabilities, autism, things like that, that it would be terrifying and very difficult to recover from even just a drill, particularly the more realistic it gets and unannounced it gets, so that the teachers don't even know how to prepare the kids. Now, you touched on a little bit on the next question that I wanted to ask you, with respect to how do we make schools safer? And, you touched on kind of more meaningful implementation of a social emotional curriculum, things like that. But what are some of the other things that you think we can do to make schools safer for all kids?
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough, that a big part of the school's job is to promote student well-being. We are way beyond you're here to read, write, and learn math, right? It is the only way you're going to be able to learn those skills and use them in real life is if you are have healthy, functioning psyche, right? And so that is number one. But then in terms of literally preventing an incident, one of the most powerful things are these tip lines. I think virtually every school has some way in which young people can report if there's bullying going on, if there's any, like see something, say something, letting people know, and then to pay attention to what's coming in on those tip lines. And then schools in Illinois have threat assessment teams that include mental health professionals to follow up on the tips. And so these tips aren't, these tips are actually part of the prevention and the health promotion that are going on. Kids can let us know that they see another student who's suffering. And then the third one is, in the event that an incident would happen, how can we reduce lethality? How can we make it less likely that people actually get killed? And the number one thing has to do with just locks on all the doors. So when you and I were growing up, probably most of our classrooms did not have
Wide open.
door locks, right? In fact, they probably weren't even, there wasn't a way to lock most doors. So that has been the one thing that has been shown to prevent death.
Yeah.
And then the second is just simply access to guns.
Right.
If somebody comes into a school with a knife or, some other weapon, the likelihood of killing people is just very, very much reduced. So those are the two biggies in terms of lethality. And they also slow down. They buy people time, basically. Yeah. If somebody is there who's dangerous, if doors are locked and there are not, guns, the likelihood that that incident is going to become deadly is greatly reduced.
Yeah, that control of access is probably one of the biggest factors, right? Outside of just keeping guns outside of the school, period. And I know I've seen that change just over the last 5 to 6 years in schools that my kids have gone to. You used to be able to just kind of walk in. Now there's like layers of access to each and every school that I, given the current environment, I actually like quite a lot. I like that they're so careful with how access is controlled as an entry point to schools.
Absolutely. Nobody's coming in that door that isn't identifying themselves, giving their name and why they're there, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of at the school level. If we kind of, zoom out a little bit, what do you think needs to happen from a policy perspective? If you were going to advise policymakers, what would you tell them?
I would say number one, we have a shortage of school-based mental health providers, whether it be social workers, psychologists, counselors, nurses. There aren't enough people to do this work, especially post-COVID. A lot of people left the profession, and there was always a bit of a shortage leading up to COVID as well. So I think that should be a top priority. And it's not just, to provide one-on-one therapy, right? We do need that. But what I'm talking about is we need to have people who can model and teach these skills and create an environment that children belong in and feel a sense of belonging. And then the second thing has to do with guns. So I know when I was teaching, so my first real job was being a middle school teacher, and there were two accidental gun incidents when I was a teacher in a period of 5 years. About every 3.5 hours, a school-aged student dies from a firearm, and then there's like almost one school shooting a week. And they are happening so frequently, they hardly make the news.
Yeah.
But specifically, automatic weapons. I want to talk about, common sense gun legislation.
Sure.
When it comes to automatic weapons, because a rifle or a revolver or only holds so many guns. But when you have an automatic weapon, you can hurt a lot of people in a very short amount of time.
Magazines.
And let's face it, the leading cause of death for children from 1 to 19 years old is a gun death. And so I feel like the least we can do is to put pressure on policymakers. The majority of Americans want common sense gun laws. And so I think it's something that's kind of been a backdrop to a lot of other things that are happening in the policy world right now. And but it continues to be a very present and real issue.
Incredibly important, but incredibly challenging in this country, right? There's such a divide on that issue. And you touched on the shortage of school psychologists. I know I've seen ratios where some school districts have one psychologist per 5,000 kids, 6,000
Yes.
kids. And it's gotten worse. I think that was even pre-pandemic. So, and I think it's
Yeah.
gotten worse across the country. So I would definitely love to see some kind of policy or legislation to support hiring more mental health professionals just for developing evidence-based programming for teachers to implement in the classroom. There's such a huge gap there.
I agree. And there's a whole team of people in schools, and we have a shortage of all of them right now. So
That's true.
I think the Department of Education was putting a lot of money into addressing shortages post-pandemic, and all of that is sort of over now. So it's something I think we should continue to voice to folks who represent us, so that our schools can be safe and healthy, and kids can have the kind of experience that we had when we were growing up.
Right. Happy, healthy, whole kids as they get through that process. Well, Dr. Huber, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Dr. Garrison. Thank you.